Good evening. Really glad to have so many of our friends from the Birmingham community here. Thank you for joining us at Temple Bethel. My name is Stephanie Butler, and I'm the program director here, and we are very pleased to have you here for a program presented by Temple Bethel, Temple Emmanuel, and the Birmingham Jewish Federation. Our speaker tonight, Julian, was born in South Africa and made Aliyah to Israel in 1976. He and his wife, Orly, are members of Kibbutz Zorah near Jerusalem. Julian has worked in Zionist and Jewish education since completing his service in the IDF in 1979 and has guided extensively both in Israel and abroad, focusing on the story of the Jewish people. Julian has deep connections to Birmingham. He's guided all of our community's Friendship Journey missions since 2008, as well as guiding groups of friends and families from Birmingham in Israel, Europe, Morocco, and South Africa over the years. And for those of you who love to learn with and from Julian, he will be leading the Birmingham Jewish Federation's community trip to Israel this spring. We're honored to have Julian back with us in Birmingham to give his personal updates and stories about Israel today. Please help me welcome Julian Resnick. It should just work.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Really? Go through the microphone. What else? Can you hear me now? Okay. Feels a bit weird having this thing growing out of my ear. So, It's great to be here, I have to say, particularly because when I come here, I see so many people that I've spent so many wonderful times with before. And I want all of you to know that I mean it. The times I've spent with many of you have been very special. Those who haven't traveled with me, I have to always begin when I speak to explain that I never learned to control any of the emotions I have. So, and I've stopped trying many, many years ago, and so I'm fine. I will get to the end of every sentence, even if it takes me a couple of moments more. Why don't you sit right over here? You good? Okay. So when I talk about things that I care about, I tend to get emotional, and I am talking about something this evening that I care about very deeply. So I want to introduce myself in the following way. So a couple of people were downstairs, so I apologize to those of you who are downstairs, because I said something downstairs that I was going to leave for over here, but you'll have that look on your face, I've heard that before. So I wanted to introduce myself in two ways. First of all, to the left of me stands an Israeli who will disagree with a huge amount of what I might say this evening. To the right of me stands an Israeli who will disagree with a lot of what I will say this evening, and that's absolutely fine. And that is absolutely fine. I celebrate the fact that I live in an open society in which people see things in different ways. I would never want to live in an on-message society. I don't like those types of realities. You can tell from my accent that we share, right? That I was born in South Africa, and I know what it means to live in a society which tries to keep everyone on message. The second way I want to introduce myself, which I shared downstairs, is that I love the Jaipur Literature Festival in Rajasthan. My wife and I go every year, every other year to the Literature Festival. This last year, this January in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, the atmosphere was terribly anti-Israel. There were some terrible things going on in the festival. And every time I spoke, and I got up to speak a lot, I introduced myself in the same way. I said, my name is Julian, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israeli, and I'm a Zionist. And now let me respond to something that has been said. And I think that probably the most powerful moment for me at the festival was when I got up to speak, and I introduced myself that way, and then I asked the couple of hundred people in the room to put up their hands if they'd heard of the United Nations debate on the 29th of November, 1947. You remember the partition of the land of Israel, of Palestine, of British-mandated Palestine? Not one person in the room. Not one person in the room had heard of it. This is a gathering of highly intelligent people from the world of literature who had a lot to say about Israel, not one of them. At the end of that particular session, a man walked over to me and he said to me, "Can I hug you?" I said, "Of course you can hug me." And he gave me a big hug. And then I said to him, "So who are you?" And he looked around just to make sure nobody was listening, and he said, "I'm the Irish ambassador to India." I thought, seriously? The Irish ambassador to India? And he's never heard of the United Nations debate on the 29th of November, 1947? So what I try and do, in the little bit that I can do, is to try and add a bit of knowledge to the huge amount of opinion that is out there. The world is filled with opinion and, sadly, less and less knowledge. So I'm going to begin with a story of 3 of my birthdays. The first one, when I was 13, was just after the Six-Day War. When I was 22 is when I came to live in Israel. My birthday, by the way, is the 2nd of July. I came to live in Israel on the 4th of July, 1976. Anybody who's traveled with me knows that was the day that the hostages were freed from Entebbe and arrived in Israel. And the third birthday was this past birthday when I turned 71. Where was I on my 71st birthday? I was in Treblinka. And I thought to myself, what am I going to say in Treblinka today? And then luckily, a man who was a rabbi in Birmingham for a long time wrote something, as he tends to do very often. His name is Rabbi Miller, Jonathan. And he wrote, coincidentally, about his grandson, who's in a preschool in Washington, D.C., a Spanish immersion preschool. And he wrote about suitcases, Jonathan. He wrote about the fact that the people teaching in the school are so anxious about their situation right now that they've prepared suitcases, the teachers in the school, just in case. And then he wrote about suitcases in Jewish history, and I stood there in Treblinka, and I said to the people with me, we can either talk only about what happened over here in the 1940s, or we can talk about what history means if you look back at it and look forward from it. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the conversations that we are having in Israel, and I want to just for a moment talk about who I'm including when I say we. We are the people who are living with a combination of PTSD, a feeling of moral injury, and something that I have named the Israeli Resilience Syndrome. And it's weird when you put the 3 together. There is no doubt in my mind that most people in Israel are suffering from trauma. No doubt in my mind. Almost all of us are suffering from trauma. There's a joke, of course, because Israelis like to joke about difficult situations, that we look forward to the post-trauma, because it'll mean that the trauma is behind us. The feeling of moral injury, the term, by the way, was coined in America at the time of the Vietnam War, and it was the question of what happens when something awful is going on, and we are the people watching it going on. What do we need to do not to end up being people who've suffered from a terrible moral injury? I heard the term was used by an Orthodox psychiatrist at a demonstration in Jerusalem, and he was asking himself and all of us, how do we need to respond when things are happening that we are uncomfortable with, that we think maybe we need to speak out about or respond to in a way that shows that we're not just bystanders? He said that we know how to deal with physical injury. We know how to deal with emotional injury. Moral injury is so complicated to deal with, and when you are a bystander, he suggested, it's the powerful question that you have to face. How do I get through this situation? The resilience is something quite extraordinary. I have to say, I've lived in Israel now for a few months short of 50 years, and I still cannot get over what Tel Aviv is like right now. Well, it's a little bit late, so maybe a couple of people have gone to bed. I mean, Tel Aviv time is late. Tel Aviv is still, it's a place in which great things are happening. Andrew and I bumped into each other in Tel Aviv, right? About a month ago. And it was a place where, it's quite hard to put these pieces together. Tremendous pain, yet at the same time, we refuse to allow that pain to dampen our enthusiasm for life, to dampen our need to go out and do things together. What I decided that I wanted to do today, after I read one poem to you, because I have to read a poem whenever I do anything, because I love reading poetry. I wanted to share some of the conversations I've had recently in Israel, because I have to say, I've been having conversations that I never imagined I would ever have in my life. And as hard as they have been, many of them, there is something very powerful about having the opportunity to be involved in extraordinary conversations. So I used this last time I was here, right? And I know some of you know the book, Shiva, an extraordinary anthology of poetry, put together by a wonderful, wonderful woman, educator in Israel called Rachel Korazim. Her mother became pregnant with her in the DP camp in Europe. At the end of the war. And her whole life she has dedicated to educating. I was with her in her living room just a couple of weeks ago with a group I was guiding. And you sit in the living room and you see the portraits on the wall of her husband's family from Hungary. People who had achieved extraordinary achievements, were professors at the universities before the war. When I say war, you know the comedian Modi? So Modi always looks for somebody in the audience who isn't Jewish, and he says, I should tell you, when I say war, I mean the Second World War. So you sit in her living room in Yafo, in Jaffa, and she teaches poetry in the most extraordinary way. So I recommend this to everyone. It's an extraordinary collection of poetry. There's a pun, of course. It's called Shiva, from Shiva, our period of mourning, and also because of the 7th of October. I want to just read one little poem to you which made such an impact on me. The way the book works is all the original poetry is in Hebrew, and then there's an English translation opposite. So if you read Hebrew, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's called Mom is Always Right. Mom said that when I grow up, there'll be no army. Mom was right. I haven't yet grown up, and already there was no army. It wasn't there when I heard the screaming outside. It wasn't there when I saw Dad so scared and stressed. It wasn't there when the door was kicked in. It wasn't there when I hid under the bed. It wasn't there when we three pushed back on the door of the safe room. It wasn't there when time just stood still. It wasn't there when they suddenly entered. It wasn't there when they tore Dad from Mom. Mom said that when I grow up, there'll be no army. Mom was right. Now I only want to tell her that she's always right. I've cried, I've screamed, and still she is silent. The poet, by the way, the extraordinary thing about this poem, he's a musician. He hadn't been able to write for years after he lost his son to a childhood disease. And the trauma of the 7th of October has made it possible for him to write again. It's quite extraordinary. I think it's an extraordinary piece of poetry. I want to share a couple of conversations that I've had and then, ask whatever questions you want about what I've said or about what Trump and Netanyahu said today. I have no idea. But you can ask, because people will ask that. The conversation. So, for example, I call a guy. I get a guy's number in Israel because I have a group coming. And he was a man who survived the Nova Festival. 7th of October, the Nova Festival. I'm assuming you're all aware of the Nova Festival. Have a conversation with him. So hard to have a conversation with him because we're talking about, a massacre that he was present at. An unbelievable massacre in that he actually survived somehow. And then because I'm budgeting the trip, I have to ask him how much he takes. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. How could I ask him how much he charges to tell the story of the trauma he went through? And I tried so hard to say to him, Amit, how much will it cost? Because I have to budget this trip. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. That was the first little conversation. The second conversation, I'm preparing a group visit to Israel. There are not many groups coming. I think it's an extraordinary time, by the way, to visit because it's so powerful. And if I like powerful visits. I don't like banal and mundane. And it's a powerful time to be in Israel. Somebody gives me a synagogue in New York. They find out that two of the members had a family member who was murdered at the Nova Festival. They decide to donate, in the memory of this young man, a Torah cover for the High Holy Days, a white Torah cover. The parents come over to visit, to see the synagogue, to meet the rabbi, wonderful rabbi, and they find out that the synagogue is going to do a trip to Israel. So she connects me, the rabbi, she connects me to the mother of the young man who was murdered, the Nova Festival. And I'm writing my itinerary, and I realize he has an unusual name, and I'm not sure how to spell it. So I phone the mother, and I say to her, struggling to get the words out of my mouth, how do you spell Eli's name? It wasn't E-L-I as I'd imagined, it was I-L-A-Y. But you're phoning a woman and asking her how she spelled her son's name who was murdered just over a year ago. What an extraordinary couple. She says to me, let me host you and the group in Israel. And we went to visit this beautiful, beautiful little place that they have created with a little vineyard, some fruit trees, and a surfboard or two, because he was a serious surfer, in his memory. I'll never forget sitting there, she speaking beautifully about her son. Her husband cannot say a word. He stands there with the most awful pain etched on his face. She can tell the story of her son. He cannot get a single word out. And I can see that he's hosting us. He's hosting us, but he cannot say a single word. By the way, and I see photographs of the son, and who does he look like? Exactly like his dad. And his dad is standing there. Somebody visited from Birmingham recently, and when I heard her own personal story, I knew that I had to connect her with this mother because of the trauma she'd been through as a mother. And there was a conversation. A conversation, which, a pretty special one. There's the look at the picture on the front page of our Aretz conversation. You know, my wife and I, we're part of the 8% of Israelis who read Haaretz. Many people do not like Haaretz, feel Haaretz is too much on the left in Israel. We like Haaretz, not only because it suits some of our politics. I have followed an idea that somebody once planted in my brain a long time ago. You have to read things that you also disagree with. don't fall into the trap of only reading the people that you agree with in every way. You must also find time to read people who are difficult for you to read. And there is the conversation with my wife. Who look at the picture on the front page. How can you turn to page 2 when you see certain pictures on page 1? The conversations with young soldiers. Having groups in Israel now, I try and get them to meet with young soldiers, to meet with young people who are going through, it's hard to comprehend what young people are going through in Israel. According to one of the articles I read in the Israeli press yesterday, 1/3 of all of the couple relationships that young soldiers are in at the moment are struggling. 1/3 of all young couples who have a man or a woman fighting in the front lines are dealing with serious couple issues at the moment. What you have to do, and I say this as someone who was in a good infantry unit long time ago, what you have to become when you're on the battlefield and in those situations is hard to let go of totally when you come home. It's hard, and I'm sure people who remember parents coming home from Europe, from the Second World War, will remember how difficult those transitions were to make. So I bring 3 young soldiers to meet with one of my groups a couple of weeks ago. And we sit in my living room on the kibbutz, and 2 of them are twins. I have twin grandsons. 2 of them are twins. I've known them literally since they were, how much do children weigh at birth, David? 6 pounds? Something like that, yeah? 6, 7 pounds. I've known them since they were 6, 7 pounds. And 2 of them, one of them has been in Gaza for months, and one of them has been on the northern border for months. The one on the northern border feels so guilty because his twin is in Gaza and it's easier on the northern border. He feels guilty. How am I supposed to feel? So they sit and talk to the group, and what is extraordinary is how they're trying so hard to hold on to their ethical being, onto their notion of how to behave. And when I see people sometimes casting aspersions on the IDF, on the Israel Defense Forces, people who've never served in the military, people who've never been in a battle situation, who don't know the first thing about how complex those situations are, how many mistakes are made. The last Israeli soldier to fall the day before yesterday, friendly fire. Because everything goes wrong. Everything goes wrong in those real situations. So you sit there with these young soldiers and they talk to my group about, what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing. I know one of them has a little child with one of my grandchildren in the preschool. The second one has 2 little children, with one of them and with another one of my grandchildren. I see how they're dealing with life. My middle child has 3 children, 6, 4, and 1. Her husband is in the reserves for 2 months as we speak. I see how she is struggling. Women, the burden that women are carrying at the moment in Israel, mothers, wives, girlfriends, quite extraordinary. I look at my Maya, of course, this afternoon I did a video. They were in the bath, having a bath. The 6-year-old and the 4-year-old were having a bath. I know that when I get back, I know which days I'm immediately on duty, morning and afternoon, looking after them. And I think of what Maya is dealing with. And I know what she wants to be doing. Now, this is the Jewish father moment now. Just finished her doctorate. Just had her first book published on higher order thinking in education. That's what she should be doing. thinking deeply about how we educate the next generation. And instead, what she has to do is to be both parents at the moment, because we are over here with 4 other grandchildren. And then the third soldier my group met with was this extraordinary young American woman called Sapir, who had come to live in Israel about 2 years ago, part of a program called Garin Sabar, which are generally young Americans who have a parent or both parents who are originally from Israel, comes to Israel, and she's now the officer in charge of a unit that is dealing with the drones, putting up the drones in Gaza so the Israeli troops can see what's going on. And she sits there and says, I have committed the next 3 years of my life to being in the army because I have to. I have a responsibility. There is something that I have to do. And I cannot believe how extraordinary these young Israelis are at the moment in terms of what they're taking on. So just last week, I guided a power couple. I guide, by the way, if you haven't picked that up. I guided a power couple from New York. And because they were a power couple, I had a budget big enough to bring all types of people to meet with them. Go online and read Sarah Tuttle-Singer, if you don't already. She's amazing. She's amazing because she defies all of the normal categories of who people are. I'll describe her. She won't mind because, as she says, she's out there. She is totally out there. So she is tattooed from head to toe. And she goes to pray at the Western Wall 3 times a day. She's devout. She dresses like a fairy. Every Tisha B'Av, she buys Roman glass jewelry. You know why? Because we're here and they're not. She says they thought they could destroy us in the year 70 when they destroyed our temple. They didn't. We're still here and they're not. She dresses as a fairy. It's amazing. Where's she from originally? Of course, she's from Venice Beach. Where else? Okay? She has 3 kids, and I can share this because she shares it openly. The first 2 with a Jewish man who, an Israeli she married in America and then went to live in Israel, and after 5 minutes with him in Israel, it was enough. She was done with him. Her third child is from a Palestinian father, who she has split up with since the 7th of October because of how he is responding to the situation that we are facing at the moment. And the wonderful thing about her is she says, the only way that I will leave Jerusalem is if they drag me out feet first. This is where I am. This is where I need to be. This is my home. And I think that she, in a way, she demonstrated to the people I was guiding that everything is complex and nuanced in Israel. Don't think that because a person has a particular stand, let's say left of center or even slightly further left of center, they're not a totally committed Zionist and totally committed to the future of the Jewish people. It's very, very, very complex. I took this same couple to meet with this wonderful, wonderful woman called Yarden Leal Yablonka, great name, who's the head of the Peres Center for Peace and Innovation in Tel Aviv. And in the conversation with them, there was a moment in which I saw the penny dropping for the folks from New York City. She said the staff over here is partly Jewish and partly Arab, about half-half. Half of the staff is Jews, half Arabs, very much the vision of the late Prime Minister and President of Israel, Shimon Peres. It's a center working for peace. One day, she says, one of my employees, a Palestinian woman, comes to me and she says, what on earth are these students in New York shouting? What is this ridiculous slogan, from the river to the sea? She said, we dropped that 30 years ago when we realized the only way forward was to try and find some type of accommodation with the Jewish people, work for a Palestinian state, but not without an Israel. And she said, and I'm watching my people and I'm seeing pennies dropping all the time. Because the Palestinian woman has come to Yael and said, what's happened? Are they caught in a time warp? Do they not know what we really need? Do they think that they are speaking on our behalf? Do they not realize they're pushing the possible decent future away from us further and further every time they go out with their nonsense in the streets. But possibly the most powerful conversation I had recently was with a man who was, in 2002 to 2002, my wife and I lived in London. I had a job in the Jewish community, a big project I was running for the Jewish community in England. My landlord and landlady were a young couple. He was a hotshot in the city, working the markets, making a fortune. They bought a second home in Hampstead Garden suburb, even if you know London. And we lived in their home. Lost touch with him totally until 2023. In 2023, his parents-in-law came to visit from London and said to them, let's go to Tiberias for Shabbat. We had to go before Shabbat because I didn't mention in the interim he'd become very, very orthodox. He'd trained as a rabbi, living in a place called Efrat. Some of you might know it. It's a large community in the West Bank. And they said, let's go to Tiberias. Come up on Friday morning to Tiberias. But they have lots of kids. They're Orthodox, so they take 2 cars, right? They drive up the Jordan Valley. He's driving the car in front with 2 kids. She's driving the car behind with 2 kids. All of a sudden, he hears terrible noises, stops the car, turns around. His wife and daughters have been murdered by terrorists. So I see him in Jerusalem one day, on a Friday night, at a hotel. I'm there with a group. He's there with a friend, Shmuley Boteach. Some of you might know him, Kosher Sex. If you ever want to read a bad rabbinical book, that's one to choose. It's actually quite a funny book. It's called Kosher Sex. He and Shmuley Boteach are sitting down, and I go over and I say, Leo. He said, how did you recognize me? I said, Leo, how did I recognize you? I've been watching the news, Leo. That's how I recognize you. And he said, you have to come. You have to come to Efrat for a conversation. Come and visit. You left something behind. Now, at this point, by the way, what I was going to do was to give it to Beth El as a gift. I still will. I have a gift something he gave me that I decided to bring over here, and I forgot to bring it. I apologize. I'd left a print by a famous Israeli artist in the house in 2002. He hoped he would see me again sometime, so he brought it with him to Israel. And he says, come and pick it up, and you'll get it in a couple of days. It's my gift to the synagogue. And I go to Efrat, and we have breakfast together. Here's a man who two years ago lost his wife and 2 daughters. And we sit down and we talk about life. We talk about faith. We talk about God. We're in very different places with respect to God. Very different places. But it's so wonderful having the conversation with him. And what I like about it particularly is he and I disagree about certain other things, I know politically, but that doesn't matter because we see each other. We recognize the humanity that we share. And I have to say, sitting with Leo, or Rabbi D, who, by the way, has just got remarried, you are aware that in that what one should do, if God forbid one loses a partner, is you have to keep living. And many, many people, particularly in the Orthodox community in Israel, marry again. I was teaching on Sunday using an extraordinary video that I got from my wife because she knows the people involved, of a young boy about 13 years old speaking under the chuppah of his mother's new marriage because his father was murdered on the 7th of October. And it's so beautiful what he says under the chuppah. It's quite extraordinary. I showed it to the group I was teaching who know no Hebrew, a Jewish group, and I asked them, so what's going on? The first person said, I think it's a bar mitzvah because of the age of the boy. which is, I think, a totally reasonable thing to assume. The second person, I know a few Hebrew words. I heard ima, and I heard chatuna, mother and wedding. Is he speaking at his mother's wedding? I said, great, so what do you think happened? And then they started putting the pieces together. But the wonderful thing about this young boy was lots of Jewish knowledge, and therefore he could quote one of the prophets and talk about how the second house will be greater than the first. But not because it's a different house, but because it's taking something from the first house. And he says there are two people present at this wedding. One of them is my dad, not obviously physically, but present. The other one is my mother's new husband's wife who passed away from cancer. So one last conversation before, maybe second last before or maybe last, we'll see, before I open this up to comments and questions. So the last conversation is the one we are having, I suppose, right now. And it is in spite of everything, Israel remains my great love conversation. And you know why? I have to say, I never imagined, I could never imagine that I would live through in my life what I have lived through in the last 2 years. And for me, I'm one of the lucky people, you know. Thank God my children are all okay, my grandchildren are okay. I'm one of the lucky people. But I do walk around in my wallet. I have the photograph of a young man. My father and mother got divorced many years ago. My father remarried. The woman he got married to has a brother, and this is her nephew. And the stories are so profound when you look at them closely. This young man grew up in an ultra-Orthodox, a Haredi family. He was the only one of the 6 children who decided to serve. Not only did he decide to serve, severe learning disabilities, never learned to read or write. He did everything he could to serve in a good unit. And eventually he was able to serve in a good unit, and he was killed in fact, when I left you guys in Grenada and flew back to Israel, it was not long after that he was killed. And it's all, so the question is, why, I ask myself sometimes, so why do I love Israel so deeply and so dearly? And I'm not exactly sure why, to be honest, but I think that's like love generally. We're often not exactly sure why. There is this incredibly strong feeling. And I think that maybe, and I wrote some notes for myself because I knew I'd have a difficult time at this point. Maybe it's because what we've achieved, in spite of the extraordinary odds, the amazing things that ordinary Israelis are doing at the moment for each other is quite exceptional. Last time I spoke here, I think I told the story of the guys who knew how to fix up hot showers and went down to Gaza. And the wonderful thing that they did was they put a clean pair of socks and a clean pair of underwear with each shower. That's seeing people. That's being aware and really caring about people. I think that my own personal story and my feelings of what I feel connected to, my feeling that Jewish history in some way lives in me, I have this notion about pronouns. I always say we when I talk about Jewish history, whether I'm talking about when we rebelled against the Romans, or when we went into exile into Babylon, or when we returned from Babylon, or when our temple was destroyed. It's always we for me. It's never they. I cannot use they when I talk about our past or our present. I think that I also love my life in Israel because I love this search for a deeper meaning to life. And I think Israel offers that in ways that I have never experienced anywhere else. And I've been lucky. I spent 2 periods of 2 years in London working. I spent a year in San Francisco. I spent 3 years working in New York. I loved San Francisco. I loved New York, present tense. I love London, but there was something missing for me in each of them. I didn't feel that every day was filled with some part of this journey to find something more powerful and more meaningful. That was going to be the end of what I said. And then when I was with my wedding group, the group that had come for the wedding, the last site we visited was Mount Herzl. Imagine that. You bring your daughter and your future son-in-law and their best friends to Israel for the wedding because the grandmother of the groom is too old and can't travel and they don't want to leave her out of the wedding. And they do this wonderful thing of deciding to take the whole wedding from New York City to Israel. And then they asked me to guide them 2 days before the wedding. And my last site is the military cemetery on Mount Herzl. Destination wedding, visiting a military cemetery. Couldn't make a living running destination weddings probably. So we're standing there and I say to them, the only people in the military cemetery today, Friday afternoon, just a couple of hours before Shabbat, are going to be bereaved families. Please remember, don't just behave as you should generally in the cemetery. Be aware that if you see somebody else, they're going to be a bereaved parent. This man sees us talking over there and he comes over. Shana Tova. A bereaved father has just visited the grave of his son, and what he wants to do before he leaves the cemetery, before he washes his hands and leaves the cemetery, is to give us a little thing saying Shana Tova with the brachot for Kiddush for Rosh Hashanah, for Birkat HaMazon for Rosh Hashanah, all in a way to remember his son. So it's another thing I'm going to leave over here in Bethel, because I do think that we have to remember our young people. I think it's incumbent on each one of us who cares. And I cannot get over this man walking over to my group of people and giving us these Shana Tova cards just before we leave the cemetery, especially knowing where he was. So, as you can tell, it's a little bit hard for me being who I am at the moment. Not easy. And you guys are going to see it in Morocco. I will be as emotional because we'll be telling the story of the Jews of Morocco when we're there in a couple of weeks' time. I think that we have a remarkable story. We're remarkable people, and we are in a very, very complex and complicated situation. I decided not to talk tonight, but feel free if you want to go there, about some of the incredible moral and ethical dilemmas I think we are facing right now in Israel. I have no problem talking about it if you wish. I think we're in an incredibly complex moment as a people in terms of who we are going to be going forward. Very complex. I don't think anybody who thinks that there are any simple answers to any of this stuff, I think it's a result of Kool-Aid. But we have to, in some way, engage with the complexity of what it means at this moment in time to be a Jew, to be an Israeli, to be a human being. I will just, one last little story about and then please ask your questions. So I came down with my wife via what's it called, the Blue Ridge Parkway. And a friend of mine came to visit us, somebody I grew up with in the old country, which is South Africa. And he showed me how to pass an old, for the national parks, when you're over a certain age, he said, we're over that certain age, maybe you can get one. We go to this lovely ranger, and ask her for the pass, if I could get a pass. And she says, I know you used to be able to, even if you weren't American, but I'm not sure what the situation is right now. And when she said that, I have to say, it was a very powerful American moment for me. She wasn't sure. She was honest. She wasn't sure. And I think we're all, with the complexity of political views, which are fine for me, living through times in which we have to be very thoughtful and very, very wary not to suffer from a terrible moral injury as we live our lives at the moment. So I wanted to tell you some stories. You know, I also want to say, before you ask your questions, it's really worth coming to Israel at the moment, I have to say. It is a profound experience. It's a different one, but it's a profound experience. And I really think that each and every one of you would find it a very moving and special place to visit in the near future. So if there are questions or comments, I would love to hear questions and comments. And by the way, if you come to Israel like Andrew did, and I'm guiding another group of people, you can do what Andrew did. Come and join me for the day. More than welcome. Anybody want to ask any questions, make any comments, feel free. Yes, Ed.
Well, I guess everybody heard about Trump's 21, now it's 20. Have you had time to digest what's in it and your feelings about it?
So look, I'm one of these people, you know, in Israel we have this term, kiki, which means kol yachol kol yodea. In other words, we say that many Israelis feel they know everything and can do everything. It's sort of a character trait of being an Israeli. I think when you get your passport, Israeli passport, you know, you now can do anything and know everything. I don't know enough about that conversation. I've seen some of the points that are out there. I don't know whether it's a fantasy or something real. I have no idea. I do want the war in Gaza to come to an end. I am aware, though, that we are still fighting an existential battle. 5 Israeli soldiers were badly injured today in Gaza. We are still fighting an enemy that wishes to destroy us. And I have to say that the complicated thing for somebody like me, who has always been on this side of the political map, is to recognize, to hold on to 2 things at the same time. My deep desire for peace and the end of conflict, and my acknowledgement and understanding that the threat is real, that there are people who wish my family dead. And Ed, as I often say when I'm dealing with hostile audiences, I sometimes start by saying, I have a confession to make. I love my grandchildren more than other people's grandchildren. I do. And therefore, I will do anything to protect them. And by the way, I'm aware that in Gaza there are grandparents who feel the same as I do, and their feelings are equally legitimate. And that's the incredible dilemma, because I know that there is an existential threat, and therefore the notion of putting the guns down and singing all we are saying is give peace a chance. It worked in the Strawberry Statement partly, but not going to work at the moment. So the question is, how do we get to that point? I'm hoping that maybe we are getting to that point, but there have to be some guarantees in there for us. They really do. And but I don't know more than you do from reading what I read. Will. Nice to see you. So I'm going to repeat the question. Sorry, you didn't finish, sorry.
The question is just
So for those who didn't hear Will's question, only 14%, there was a podcast, and they talked about only 14% of Americans under the age of 30 support Israel. What does that mean? And also, there's a lot of international isolation. What does that mean for the future of the relations between America and Israel? So I would have added another question, Will, which is, what does that say about what has happened to the education system in the United States of America? Your first question is important, and I will relate to it, but I think there's a second question out there. What has happened? You know, what has happened that there was Israel's graded at parody. So one of the big parodies was done on a show, a satirical television show, showing young gay people from New York phoning up Hamas in Gaza and saying, we're with you, and Hamas operatives saying, and we'll throw you off the roof. We'll throw you off the roof. And so there's an unbelievable disconnect. You know, there really is an unbelievable disconnect. The thing that I think we have done wrong is I think from the outset it was clear that the only battle that Hamas might win is the battle for the way people understand what has happened. And they have been diabolically brilliant in managing that battle. They have, besides using, AI to sort of create false, pictures of children, they've also used, of dead children. They've also used children and elderly people as human shields, knowing what it does. It's incredibly effective because it's absolutely awful when that happens. I also have to say that there are members of my government, and I have to say my because, it's my government, who have made every mistake possible in dealing with the situation. When a government minister says, nuke them, that's ridiculous. It's idiotic. It's the type of statement that invites condemnation, as it should. When there are ministers in our government who have behaved in a way that I think has made it increasingly difficult for us to strike back on the battle for public opinion. I have to say, I will tell you that last Friday when I was guiding in Jerusalem, somebody asked me a question, which was totally off topic. She asked me, do you still believe in a two-state solution? And I said, totally off topic, but I'm glad you asked it for two reasons. One, it's an important question, and two, because you're now going to see me struggling to give an answer. And it's important to see people like me struggling to give an answer to that, because, I still believe in peace and a two-state solution, but the real question for anybody who's proposing a particular scenario is the roadmap. So how do you get there? It's all very well to believe in A, B, or C. That's fine. We all have visions of what we want the world to be, but the real question is how we get there. And I think that we're living through a time in which we have had to take certain actions to take care of ourselves, which are awful to see. I can't imagine what it must have been like if, imagine Dresden being shown on television. Imagine Hamburg. I guided a group once in, I can't remember, somewhere in Europe. One of the people in the group was a woman who, a long time ago, this was about 30 years ago, that I guided. She was 6 years old in Hamburg as a little German girl during the war, hiding from the bombers. We had to deal with this fascinating question. Did we feel empathy for her or not? She was 6 years old. But it was tough. In Israel, one of the big questions we're dealing with at the moment is what we call the limits of empathy. It's so hard it's so hard to feel empathy. I was with a group down in Sderot where terrible things happened. Terrible things happened on the 7th of October. One of the terrible things that happened on the 7th of October was a a couple was in a car with their 6-year-old and their 2-year-old in the back of the car. The man and his wife were murdered by Hamas gunmen, Nukba terrorists. Thank God the 2 children were left in the back of the car. And when 2 people approached the car, one was an Israeli policeman and one was a Bedouin who came to help. The little 6-year-old who realized that she had to take control, right? Because the parents were dead. Remember? She turned around and said to them 2 words in not very good grammatical Hebrew, but she said, Atem Yisrael? Are you Israel? In other words, have you come to save us? A 6-year-old protecting a 2-year-old in the back seat of the car after her parents had been murdered in the front seat. I was there with a group, and a guy walked over to us and said, kill them all. Kill the children too, because they will be terrorists one day. He was the brother of the father who had been killed in the car. What could we say to him? Nothing. One of the most difficult things in Israel at the moment is sometimes people say things that I almost want to immediately respond to, but I think to myself, hang on, who are they? Who have they lost? What has happened in their family? What did they see? It's so all-encompassing that and that's when we find it so hard when people who are so far away, as it were, sort of talk about things as if they know what actually happened on the ground. Yeah, and I know how awful things are in Gaza. They're absolutely terrible. And it suits the Hamas. That's the tragedy. They are killing their people in ways that are, the things that they're doing to their own people. I was in a meeting in Ramallah before the war, and this guy says to me, you know that you're not our problem. Hamas is our problem. Because of Hamas, we'll end up in the Stone Age. God forbid that should happen to them, but it is, so I'm not sure what I could say to those young people, except I try and engage them in conversation. I'm happy to talk with people who disagree with me, as long as they speak nicely. I won't speak to them if the same time that this happened to me in Jaipur, an American there started cursing me in ways that I couldn't believe. And I said, sir, I know you disagree with me, but speak nicely and we'll have a conversation. But he couldn't. He could only call me, use every swear word known to humanity to talk about me as a Jew. I can't speak to people like that. But we face a huge problem, huge problem, and you're right to bring it up. Yes.
So do you think Qatar is playing 2 sides of a coin?
Of course. Of course. They've always done that.
I mean, do you think, I have heard, I don't know if this is true, because I don't believe any big media anymore, that they have funded American universities for years, and thus that is why there's been such a lean and a shift to this. I mean, where did all these Palestinian flags even come from, really? I mean, it's not like they're at Walmart.
So well, if maybe Walmart will start, if it sells well, I'm sure Walmart will start selling it. Yeah. So the Qatar for years has been playing, on every side, for years. But the question we have to ask ourselves, a more difficult question than the Qatar question. Why did we enable the money from Qatar? Why did we enable Hamas to use it? I mean, our government at some point has to answer the question of, didn't we make the most extraordinary mistake? You know that, I don't know if you know this, but before Operation Barbarossa began, when the Germans attacked Russia, do you know how many German troops were massed on the Russian border before the Operation Barbarossa started? There were 4 million German soldiers on the Russian front. But the Russian intelligence, the picture they had created was that Germany would deal with the British first and then get to the Russians. So they told the Russian leadership, nothing to worry about. They're just moving out of the range of the RAF. We told ourselves, totally incorrectly, it's fine. The Qatari money will pacify them. And we made every mistake possible. Our leaders are the ones who have to be held accountable. Qatar has been playing every side forever. That's their game. Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. So so I'll give an opinion, okay? The question was, how do you wrap your mind around the fact that there were righteous Gentiles during the Second World War who saved and helped Jewish people, and now even though huge amounts of money were offered to Gazans if they found a way to return hostages, nobody came forward. So I would say. I would just give an opinion because I'm not an expert. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in areas that I'm not an expert in. I think there are a couple of things happening. One of the things that we have to remember is that most Palestinians in Gaza live in total fear of the Hamas. Hamas is ruthless. Hamas will murder any Palestinian who they think in any way is not towing the line. We saw just a couple of weeks ago they executed 3 people in a public square. So I think that there's an unbelievable fear of what will happen. The second thing is, on NPR, there was an extraordinary interview. What's the woman's name? Somebody Friedman, who has a program on NPR, Democracy Now! She interviewed an American professor of Palestinian origin. And she asked him an interesting question. And the question was, to what extent is Hamas mainstream in terms of Palestinian ideology? And his answer was unbelievably honest. He said, the tactics are not necessarily mainstream, but the ideology is totally mainstream. And he said, you need to understand that in terms of the Palestinian narrative, there's no place for the Jews. That's what he said. He was, and I thought he was being incredibly honest on the show. And that is so hard for someone like me. Someone like me who feels that ultimately, that's where I live, that's where my family is, or at least most of it. Are we going to live by the sword forever? Is that going to be the only way we have an Israel? Or is there going to be some way we can move towards peace? I mean, for me, one of the most difficult speeches ever made in Israel was made at the beginning in the 1950s, right at the beginning, by Moshe Dayan. He spoke at a funeral on Kibbutz Nachal Oz. Ironically, a kibbutz that was, also suffered a lot now. A guy called Ro'i Rottenberg. And he said in the 1950s, right, 75 years ago, if my maths is okay, he said, we will always live by the sword. He said, that's it. We will live by the sword. The other people who live here will never accept us. And that is a profound question that we have to deal with. Is there a way, forward? So, over the years, I've encountered different things that have moved me in one way or the other. I used to go to Ramallah a lot with some of the political groups that I did. And I'd sometimes meet people who really felt like partners. And I ask myself now, so are they really partners or not? If there are no partners, what do we do? How do we live a life that is filled with pleasure and joy in the future? And your question is a very hard one for me to deal with, because of all the Palestinians that I worked with, I have a lot of Palestinian colleagues from my work that I've done over the years. Only one of them has been in touch with me on a regular basis. Her cousin, by the way, was the ambulance driver who was murdered at the Nova Festival, Darausha. Her uncle is a very famous Israeli Palestinian, Muhammad Darausha. And she still believes very strongly in the narrative of having a Palestinian state, but she also acknowledges and accepts that there needs to be an Israel next to it. But she's the only one of my Palestinian colleagues who I can say is regularly in touch with me and has spoken up. So not much of an answer for you. I don't think I satisfied you in terms of the way I answered the question. So have we reached the end of this evening? How do you end evenings in Bethel? So, as Danny Gordis said this week in his wonderful, wonderful piece that he wrote, we hope that there'll be better days. May there be better days. Amen. Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay. If you are staying afterwards to visit with Julian, there are refreshments in the boardroom, which is when you get down the hall, it's to the right. So, thank you for coming.